Hello and welcome to the race edition for today's race weekend data analysis for the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2020. My name is Alex Does F1 Stuff and I hope you are all having a very good day. Now, if you have not seen the previous episodes covering Austria and Styria, as well as the practice edition and the qualifying edition of Hungary, I'll pop a little playlist to that in the card in the corner. Now, the main aim of this series is to get your guys' input into what exactly you want to see when it comes to data analysis, so I can nail this series for 2021 and stick with one consistent format from the first race all the way to the end, rather than me sort of chopping and changing all of them throughout the season as it progresses. And today we are looking at the race data for the Hungarian Grand Prix. So we will begin with the race results, and it is a victory for Lewis Hamilton from Max Verstappen and Valtteri Bottas, with Lance Stroll P4, then Alex Albon P5, then Vettel, Perez, Ricciardo, Magnussen and Sainz are your points scorers, with Leclerc just outside of the points, ahead of Kvyat, Norris, Ocon, Grosjean, the two Alfa Romeos and the two Williams, all the way at the back, with Gasly the only failure to finish. And by that I just mean the only driver that didn't finish the race. And so the first thing I can do with this is I can work out a small little positions chart, and it ends up working out a little like this. We have a manic amount of positional changes in the first couple of laps, as it started wet, and went dry, and everyone pitted, all sorts of leader changes, and then there was a couple between laps 30 and laps 42, and then basically nothing till the very end on lap number 70. And then equally from the positions table, I can go and work out a laps chart as well. So this maps on every single driver's lap time in this Grand Prix. Now, unfortunately, we can see tiny little peaks, which are the pit stops. However, the data has been massively skewed by an over 200-second lap time from Nicholas Latifi. That's almost 2.5 or 3.5 minutes. So what I can do with this is I can just zoom in on the particular section that we are interested in, and we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. And now, like I've done in the previous episodes, I'm going to try my best to highlight the different bands of racing. So at first it may just look like a bunch of jumbled lines, but between these two blue arrows we can see the pace difference between the two Mercedes and Max Verstappen, and then around about lap 20 to the second blue arrow we have people like Alex Albon and the McLarens joining that fight. But then just above these two blue arrows, I can highlight these sections here which show different bands of racing. There is a nice little air gap in between these lines, which just shows the pace differential between different sets of cars. And then we can trace these green lines along to these two yellow lines here, and there are still 3 individual bands of racing up until the midway point, where there is a clear pace differential between the first half of the race and the second half, and at this big long red line it's all jumbled. Everyone is the same as everyone is pitting, and just everything is going crazy until they get onto those new tyres, and then there is a big step down in the pace, about a second per lap improvement for everybody. And then just a bit further off to the right of the red line, there is still 3 bands of racing just here. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's roughly where my arrows are pointing. And then we can translate this all the way to the end, where it definitely fans out a little bit more, and it's these black lines which define the 3 individual bands of racing. Now, it's these 3 bands that we regularly see when it comes to lap time charts, as there are those 3 distinct groups of teams. Occasionally there is 4, so normally we have the top couple of teams, Mercedes and Red Bull, then we have all of the midfield, and then we have the last couple of teams. But sometimes when there are 4, we end up with the midfield sort of splitting into 2. There's the upper midfield and then there's the lower midfield. But more often than not, there are 3 separate bands of racing at any one stage of the Grand Prix. But now we're just going to delve on into the teammate comparisons, and we begin, of course, with Mercedes. And this hasn't changed since the previous episode, the one that looked at the Styrian data not too long ago. So we start in the top left with the lap chart. So we map on Lewis Hamilton in the black line and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise line. And again here you can see that in the middle, around lap 36, there is definitely a distinct pace difference from the left hand side to the right hand side of the graph after their first pit stops. Technically second if you exclude the ones that happened on lap number 1 to lap number 4. And if I just map on this grey dotted line here, this is the fastest Mercedes driver of the previous race in the previous year. And we can see that Mercedes hasn't really improved much on their 2019 lap times going around Hungary. Now that could be because the first half was a bit wet and it was a drying track, so it wasn't always dry. But interestingly, the grey line still follows exactly the same pace gain. It still has that big step from the first half down to the second half. And then below this graph I can just fill in the Mercedes gaps, and it is always Lewis Hamilton that was ahead of Valtteri Bottas all the way to the very end on lap number 70. And then in the top right I can fill in their positions chart, which just shows exactly what position they were in on what lap. And then finally, to fill in the bottom right, we have the percentage pace difference graph, Hamilton to Bottas. Now the way that this graph is worked out is I take every single Hamilton lap time and I divide them by every single Bottas lap time, and I end up with a bunch of values above 100. Those are times where Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and then I have a bunch of values below 100, and those are when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. I've then ordered those from the largest number, Lewis Hamilton's fastest advantage, all the way to the lowest number, which is Valtteri Bottas's largest advantage. And then if we go back to the data, I've plotted those lines onto this graph and we can fill in Lewis Hamilton's differences and Valtteri Bottas. And then I can just split this line down the middle here, and we can determine that for 45.7% of the laps that the two Mercedes were running together, Valtteri Bottas was the fastest of the two Mercs, and therefore 54.3% of those laps, Lewis Hamilton was the faster car. Again, fairly even, exactly as they have been for the previous two races. But now, just drawing your attention to the gaps chart, I can highlight this peak here, and this is the pit stop for Valtteri Bottas over on their positions chart. And most of the graphs that we're coming up to see have this first initial peak, and that is because there are all sorts of pit stops going on. Whether they're later or earlier than their teammate depends on whether this is a peak or a trough. And then we have a section of the graph on the top left between these two green lines where it's fairly consistent racing between the two Mercs, but Hamilton is roughly just a little bit quicker. There are occasional sections where Valtteri Bottas is quicker, and this equates to this nice gentle increase from around 20 seconds gap ahead for Lewis Hamilton to about 35 just before the first pit stop, which occurs for Valtteri Bottas just here by the red line, which shoots up the gap all the way to above 50 seconds, around 55, and then shortly after his pit stop he takes advantage of the new performance, and he is about 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds faster than Lewis Hamilton, which equates to this sort of gentle decrease in the line until Hamilton comes in for his pit stop, which is this black steep increase by the green arrow, which is represented by the gap now coming down to roughly 25 seconds. So the gap before the pit stop to Valtteri Bottas from Lewis Hamilton was 35 seconds, and then after the pit stop it came down to about 25 seconds. So Valtteri Bottas took advantage of the undercut to slice 10 seconds from the gap. Unfortunately for Bottas though, there is a second pit stop here in yellow, which equates to this other steep increase in the line as well. But then between these two grey lines, he actually takes advantage of this second pit stop, and he manages to decrease the gap once again from just over 40 seconds to just under 30, again taking a nice 10-second gap out of Lewis Hamilton, but unfortunately it wasn't quite enough to close it fully, and then Hamilton actually comes in for his fastest lap pit stop to try and bag the extra bonus point, and the gap comes all the way down to just under 10 seconds, but enough for Hamilton to secure the win. And so with the pro forma all laid out for today's episode, we will move on into team number 2, and that is Red Bull, and we fill in their graphs like this. And we start with their percentage pace difference from Verstappen to Albon, and we split this down the middle, and we can determine that for 11.4% of the laps raced together, Albon was the fastest of the Red Bull cars, and therefore for 88.6%, a massive majority, Verstappen was the fastest car. And so turning our attention to the graph on the left, we can see that again, like the Mercedes pair, they haven't really made much of an increase from their previous 2019 running. And the only real notable difference comes from the fact it was a wet start, so it takes them a while to actually get to their 2020 pace, but there are no significant gains made, especially in the second half of the race. However, just highlighting the first peak once again on the gaps chart, and this equates to Albon's pit stop on the positions chart, which sends him back to position 14, exactly the same as the Mercedes peak as well. But then on the lap chart, we can highlight this section in green, which shows consistently for around 30-ish laps, maybe 28 laps, it was Max Verstappen who was always faster than Alex Albon, which shows this enormous increase in the gap from about 15 seconds after the first round of manic pit stops up to 50 seconds. He increased that gap by over half a minute. It is then Albon who makes the first pit stop in the middle of the race, which then leaps up the gap to over 70 seconds, but then very, very shortly after, it is Max Verstappen who comes in, and he manages to pull this gap back down to 50 seconds. Neither driver taking advantage of the undercut, as there wasn't much advantage to gain, as neither driver stayed out for very long before the other pitted. There's then a section directly after their pit stops, just between these two orange lines, where they are very, very consistent because both drivers are on brand new tyres, so they can't take advantage of any undercuts as they're both on the same strategy, and so the gap stays at about 50 seconds until after this section of racing where Albon seems to drop off and Verstappen seems to go a little bit quicker between the two red arrows, and this equates to the gap increasing from 50 seconds up to 70 seconds at the end of the Grand Prix. And then from Red Bull, we head on over to McLaren and team number 3. And of course, we start with the percentage pace difference from Norris down towards Sainz, and we split this down the middle, and we can see that for 59.6% of the laps they raced together, it was Carlos Sainz that was the fastest of the McLaren pair, with 40.4% of the laps raced going in favour of Norris. And then this is the first team that has an inverse of the peak that we have seen in the previous two graphs for Red Bull and Mercedes, which is shown by this small little gap, the only time that Lando Norris led Carlos Sainz in this race, which is shown here by their positions chart, when Lando Norris doesn't pit or pits after Carlos Sainz, gaining a bunch of places over all the people that did pit, and Carlos Sainz loses a bunch of places in that pit stop, but then gains them back after the others pit too. And we then have this first section between the green arrows where Carlos Sainz is about 7 to 8 tenths quicker than Lando Norris per lap for around 10 laps, which massively increases the gap from 5 seconds to almost 15, to just over 15 seconds. However, highlighted in this dark green arrow, Carlos Sainz ends up having a little bit of a slow lap compared to Lando Norris, who is a tiny bit more consistent over these 5 laps here, which is shown by this small decrease in the gap from just over 15 seconds to just under 15 seconds. Then the duo of the McLaren pairs are fairly even between these two yellow arrows, which again is shown by the slight increase from just under 15 seconds to just under 20 seconds increase in the gap. However, it is Lando Norris who is the first to pit here in the red line, which increases this just under 20 second gap to around 40 seconds. He then takes small advantage of this to slowly bring it down to around 35 seconds until Carlos Sainz pits next to this grey arrow, which has a big steep decrease in the gap to around 12 seconds. So just before Lando Norris's pit stop, he had a gap to Carlos Sainz of around 18 seconds, and then after the pit stop, it was around 12 seconds. So again, he took advantage of that undercut. But then after Carlos Sainz pitted, we then have this section of racing here between the two sort of orangey lines, where again Lando is going a little bit quicker in the middle section, but they're fairly even, and it is shown here from the gap being around 12 seconds after the pit stop to just under 10 by the time we end the Grand Prix. But I'm not entirely sure what happened at the end highlighted in the black here, but there is an enormous 1.5 second gulf. Carlos Sainz seemed to just ramp it up at the very end, and Lando Norris just seemed to not. And that equated to this really steep increase in just the last couple of laps, from just under 10 seconds to almost 25. Now, unfortunately, this is where the fact that it was an old Grand Prix is coming in to haunt me, as I can't remember what happened in the last couple of laps. Whether there was an issue for Lando Norris or not, I'm not 100% sure. But leaving McLaren, we head on into team number 4, and that is Racing Point, the battle between Sergio Perez and Lance Stroll, a battle in which the Canadian actually came out on top over the Mexican. But of course, splitting the percentage pace difference graph down the middle like we always do at the beginning, we see that for 65.2% of the laps raced, it was actually Stroll that was the fastest of the two Racing Points, and therefore for 34.8% it was in favour of Sergio Perez. And the first section of racing that we can highlight is between these first two blue arrows here, in which Lance Stroll is consistently getting a little quicker every single lap, unlike Sergio Perez, who has a large mistake and goes slower until he manages to pick up the pace, which is shown by this enormously steep increase from just over 10 seconds to around 30 seconds, until this section of racing between the two green arrows where they are very, very consistent. Again, a small little mistake from Sergio Perez with an 84-second lap around lap 30, which is just this nice, gentle increase in the gap from about 30 seconds to about 35. But very interestingly, the two Racing Points here by the red arrow pit on the same lap. Whether they double stack or not, it's not entirely clear by these graphs, and again, I can't remember exactly what happened in the Grand Prix, but they definitely pitted on the same lap. And if we see after the pit stop between these two dark green arrows, it is actually Sergio Perez who takes advantage more than Lance Stroll of the fresh tyres, bringing the gap down from about 35 seconds to around 26-27 seconds. However, for the second pit stop, it is only Lance Stroll that comes in this time, and it's highlighted here by the yellow arrow, and the gap gets sliced from about 28 seconds down to around just below 8. However, by the time of the second pit stop, it is just Lance Stroll who comes in, and that is represented by this steep decrease in the time from around 25 seconds to just below 10. However, directly after this pit stop phase, he massively takes advantage, going around half a second quicker than Sergio Perez, which is shown by this steep increase, again increasing that gap from 10 seconds to about 30. And then leaving Racing Point, we head on into team number 5, and that is Renault. And interestingly, they have made some gains. Very similarly to Racing Point, they've made some gains from their previous year, especially once again in the second half of the race, when the race was dry. Roughly half a second in some occasions, and also a second in some also. But again, turning our attention to the percentage pace difference graph, we can split this down the middle and say that for 24.6% of the laps raced, Esteban Ocon was the faster Renault, and for a massive majority of 75.4%, it was Daniel Ricciardo who was the faster of the two Renaults. But highlighting this first section of racing here between the two blue arrows, where Daniel Ricciardo was roughly half a second, sometimes a second faster than Esteban Ocon, for about 10 or so laps after the first pit stops to about lap 14, 16 sort of time, which equates to this big steep increase from the gap being 5 seconds to just over 15. However, just up here there is a small mistake from Daniel Ricciardo highlighted in green, which brings the gap down from just over 15 seconds to just under 15 seconds. However, after this mistake highlighted between the two dark green arrows, Daniel Ricciardo consistently goes faster than Esteban Ocon, gently increasing the gap from just below 15 seconds to just above 15 seconds. And then we get to a pit stop here highlighted by the sort of orangey looking colour for Esteban Ocon, which increases the gap massively to over 40 seconds. And unfortunately, after the pit stop, Esteban didn't really take advantage immediately of his fresh tyres, but in the second stage, just before Ricciardo's pit stop, he did, gently decreasing this gap from 40 seconds to 35 seconds. It was then Ricciardo's turn to come in for his pit stop, highlighted by this first red arrow, which sliced the gap from around 35 seconds to around 15. And then there is this final section of racing highlighted by these two dark grey arrows where Ricciardo is consistently quicker for the majority of these laps, if not for just lap 66, where he is around 0.2 faster than Esteban Ocon, which gently increases this gap from 15 seconds from the midway of this race all the way to 40 seconds at the end. And then moving from Renault, we head on into Ferrari, the Scarlet Red team, and the battle between Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc. And of course, looking at the percentage pace difference graph first, we split this down the middle, and for 72.5% of the laps raced, Sebastian Vettel was the faster of the two Ferraris, compared to 27.5% of the laps raced were in favour of Charles Leclerc. But turning our attention to their laps chart, again we can see that their 2019 pace was a lot faster in the first half, but that's because the track was a little bit wet. So if we look at the second half, we can see they have lost a little bit of time. Not a great deal, they're still sort of there, maybe about 2 or 3 tenths per lap. But if I just highlight this section here on their positions chart, it shows the manic order of the pit stops, where both of them pit and they end up losing all sorts of positional changes. They swap places and things like that, and that's shown just here on the gaps chart as well, where it was Sebastian Vettel leading, and then Charles Leclerc took over that Ferrari lead. And then after those manic pit stops, we have this first section of racing between the two dark green arrows where they're sort of even, but Sebastian Vettel is maybe a touch quicker overall, as if we look at the gaps chart, he manages to bring that gap down from just under 5 seconds to just over nothing, or just under 1 second. I think that's the way around I should say it. There is then a slow lap just here from Charles Leclerc before his pit stop, which enables Sebastian Vettel to get past, which is highlighted just here on the positions chart, just before Charles Leclerc's pit stop, which ends up popping the gap all the way at above 30 seconds. And that's what really cost Leclerc, as he never really managed to get that pace back. However, after this pit stop, he was sort of able to take advantage of the fresh tyres, bringing the gap down from just over 30 seconds to just over 25. So he managed to get some of the time back, but not a lot. And then it was Vettel's turn to come in for his pit stop, highlighted here in the red arrow, and afterwards he managed to take advantage of the overcut and come out ahead of Charles Leclerc. And then we just have this massive final section of the race between the two dark grey arrows here, in which Sebastian Vettel was consistently quicker than Charles Leclerc, which is evident here by the big increase in the gap from just over 5 seconds to around 35. And then moving from the Scarlet Ferraris, we head on into Alfa Tauri and the battle between Kvyat and Gasly. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot to show, as Gasly was the only retirement on lap number 19. But splitting the percentage pace difference graph down the middle, we can see that for 73.3% of the laps raced, it was Kvyat who was the faster car, and therefore for 26.7% of the laps, it was Gasly who was the faster car. There is just one small thing I can highlight here, in which Kvyat comes into the pits in the first manic stage, which increased the gap in Gasly's favour to over 25 seconds, but other than that, that is all I can show. And so leaving Alfa Tauri, we head on into Alfa Romeo instead, and this is the battle between Raikkonen and Giovinazzi. And starting as always with the percentage pace difference graph, we split this down the middle, and for 65.2% of the laps raced, it was Giovinazzi who was the faster of the two, and for 34.8% it was Kimi Raikkonen. And taking a look at the laps chart in the second half of the race, as the first half is a little bit pointless, we can see that Alfa Romeo have actually gained on their 2019 pace, especially from laps 42 onwards. They're about half a second faster than their previous year. But the first thing to highlight for the Alfa Romeos is here on their positional chart, which is the only time that Giovinazzi got in front of Kimi Raikkonen this whole race, which is highlighted here on the gaps chart as well, and this was of course because of all of the pit stops in the beginning of the race. We then have this first section of racing between the two dark green arrows where they were very consistent, which is just here between these two dark green arrows on the gaps chart, where it sort of hovered between 15 and 10 seconds. Right up until it was Giovinazzi's turn to come into the pits, and he ended up coming out 45 seconds behind Kimi Raikkonen. However, he did take enormous advantage of his new fresh tyres, being around half a second faster than the Finnish man, bringing the gap down gently from 45 seconds to 35 seconds over about 10 laps. It was then Raikkonen's turn to pit here in the dark red arrow, slicing this gap down and his lead over his teammate to around 5 seconds. However, shortly after this, Giovinazzi came in for a second pit stop, raising the gap to again 30 seconds. But as always, he took advantage once again for a second time of his fresh tyres, once again going half a second faster than Kimi Raikkonen, which is shown by a nice gentle decrease in the gap from 30 seconds to just under 20. However, the fresh tyre advantage sort of wore off, and for the last section of the race highlighted by these two light red arrows, not a lot happened, and the gap stayed consistently between 20 seconds until the end of the Grand Prix. And then penultimately for today's episode, we have the Haas duo of Romain Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen. And of course, starting with the percentage pace difference, we split this down the middle. For 29% of the laps raced, it was in favour of Romain Grosjean, and for 71%, it was in favour of Kevin Magnussen. And once again, like Alfa Romeo, Haas have actually gained around half a second on their 2019 lap time, especially in the second half of this Grand Prix. But the first section of racing that we can highlight is between these two blue arrows, where they're fairly consistent. A little bit in favour of Kevin Magnussen, as the gap does increase from just over 1 second to around 10 seconds over time, but it's not a massive increase. It is Romain Grosjean who comes into the pits first for Haas, as highlighted here by the light green arrow. However, a lap after, it is Kevin Magnussen who comes in straight away, so there is just one small little peak and not a lot else other than that, so they can't take advantage of the fresh tyres for the undercut, as the gap extends to 40 seconds and then immediately comes back down to exactly what it was pre-pit stop. And then the next section of racing to highlight is between these two dark green arrows, where neither driver can take advantage of their fresh tyres at all, and the gap stays consistently around 15 seconds. There is then a mistake from Romain Grosjean around an 86-second lap time, which is a bit unfortunate, as that causes a steep increase in the gap to about 20 seconds, and then we end up with this nice ending piece where Magnussen is roughly a tenth to a tenth and a half faster than Grosjean per lap, which equates to this nice increase in the gap here. And then finally we head on into Williams and the battle between George Russell and Nicholas Latifi. And of course, starting with the percentage pace difference, we split this down the middle, and for 27.7% of the laps raced, it was Latifi who was in front, and it was 72.3% of the laps raced, it was George Russell who was the faster of the two cars. Now, Williams have actually gained significantly on their 2019 car, roughly around a second a lap, from the 2/3 mark all the way to the end of the race, from about laps 20 to the very end. And it was actually Nicholas Latifi who was the first to lead the Williams cars, as George Russell pitted very early on, and that is highlighted just here with a positional change as well. However, if we remember, I highlight this section here, it was Latifi who massively skewed my lap time data with his almost 3-minute lap time, which extends the gap to 100 seconds. That is almost 2 minutes. Which is shown just here by this green arrow, so there isn't a great deal of detail in this graph as we're dealing with such large increments of time. There is then this section of racing here between the two dark green arrows where they're fairly consistent, so the gap stays at just over 100 seconds. It seems ridiculous to say that the gap between two cars is well over a minute and a half. Then George Russell is the first to pit here in the yellow arrow, which is this teeny decrease in the gap from around 120-130 seconds to just below 100 seconds. However, immediately after, he is able to take full advantage of that speed, and he is about 2 seconds a lap faster than Latifi, and he manages to increase this gap from 100 seconds to around 130 seconds. Latifi then goes on a couple of laps that are just filled with errors, along with a pit stop here highlighted in red, which increases the gap massively to around 160 to 180 seconds, which is bordering 3 minutes. There is then this second steep increase in the time here, which again is shown by this line here, extending the gap to almost 250 seconds. That's pushing 4 minutes. And then even after all of these pit stops and all of these mistakes, Latifi is not able to take advantage of any of the fresh tyres, as between these two dark grey arrows, it is George Russell who is significantly faster than his Canadian counterpart, which is shown by this steep increase. Now this is a very steep increase, going from just under 250 seconds to almost 300 seconds. And 300 seconds is almost 5 minutes by the end of the Grand Prix. This really wasn't a good race at all for the Canadian. And there we go, there is all of the teammates broken down for the race data of today's Grand Prix. I've just got the driver of the weekend left to do, so we will jump on into that section now. And we start, of course, with the individual performances. These are the same 13 main categories, which just look at your own individual performances, excluding anything that happened with your teammates. Now, I've had a few questions about these regarding things like retirements and all sorts of stuff like that. I can break down exactly how I work these out and what I reference things to if you would like to see a video explaining all of that. But I won't go into it too much today as it is already an extremely long video, even though we're just looking at the race data. So based off of these 13 main categories for your individual performance over the entire weekend, practice, qualifying and the race, we end up with an order that looks a little bit like this for the individual ranks. Lewis Hamilton was declared the best individual racer for Hungary, then Lance Stroll, Pierre Gasly, Lando Norris, Vettel, Ocon, Bottas, Verstappen, Perez, Albon, all so very, very close, just 1.8 points covering them. Then there's a small step to Carlos Sainz, all the way down to the two Haas cars at the back. And then from this, we can just look at the teammate performances, and these look at 15 main categories, all with their own subcategories, etc., etc. But these are only looking at your performances against your teammate, and we end up with an order that looks a bit like this. Max Verstappen was declared the best against their teammate, then George Russell, Gasly, Ricciardo, Hamilton, Vettel, Magnussen, Norris, all the way down to Albon at the back. And then averaging out your individual ranks and your teammate ranks, we end up with the driver of the weekend, which looks a bit like this. Lewis Hamilton and Pierre Gasly are joint driver of the weekends for Hungary, based on the practice, qualifying and the race data. Then it is Max Verstappen, then Sebastian Vettel, Lance Stroll, Lando Norris, George Russell, all the way down to Danny Kvyat and Romain Grosjean at the back. And there we go, that is the end of the race weekend data analysis for Hungary and this race edition episode as well. Now, one small change that I'm thinking of making is doing a driver of practice, driver of qualifying, and then driver of the race, and therefore driver of the weekend overall in the 3 individual parts of these episodes, as I feel that could be really interesting, seeing who performed best in practice, who performed best in qualifying, and then who performed the best in the race, and then averaging those 3 categories out, I can then see who performed best over the whole weekend. But please let me know what you guys think about that idea, and let me know as well if you'd like to see anything else included in this race edition of the data analysis. Also, if you're interested in any of the F1 merch behind me, either the Max Verstappen cap and the Suzuka track map, or anything that could be in the Drive Crate box, check out my Drive Crate unboxing for their 2021 January season preview box. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.